The students at Lincoln High thought they knew exactly what would happen when they cornered the quiet new girl. They thought pushing her down those marble stairs would be just another Tuesday power play, another reminder of who ruled the school. What they didn't know was that Maya Chen had spent 4 years perfecting kicks that could shatter concrete blocks and learning from a coach who taught her that true warriors choose their battles wisely. By the time the dust settled, everyone would understand that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who says nothing at all. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya Chen pressed her palm against the cool glass of the passenger window as her mother's silver Honda pulled through the gates of Lincoln High School. The October morning carried the crisp bite of New England autumn, so different from the perpetual warmth of San Diego that still felt like home in her memory. Red and gold leaves drifted across the pristine courtyard where students clustered in their morning rituals, their voices creating a symphony of unfamiliar East Coast accents that made her stomach flutter with nervous energy. At 17, Maya had learned to make herself small in new places. Her petite frame and quiet demeanor had always helped her slip through crowds unnoticed, a skill she'd perfected through 3 different moves in her childhood. Her straight black hair fell past her shoulders like a curtain she could hide behind, and her dark eyes held a watchful quality that most people mistook for shyness. The truth was more complicated. Maya wasn't shy, she was cautious, always scanning, always assessing, always remembering the lessons Coach Alina had drilled into her during those grueling afternoon sessions at Vasquez Combat Sports. The pharmaceutical company had offered her mother an opportunity too good to refuse, which meant trading the laid-back beaches of California for the rigid social structures of Fairfield, Connecticut. Maya understood the sacrifice her parents were making, but that didn't make walking through those imposing brick archways any easier. Lincoln High looked like something from a movie about privileged teenagers, all ivy-covered walls and expensive cars in the parking lot. The kind of place where your zip code determined your social status before you even opened your mouth. Her first class was advanced biology, and Maya slipped into a seat near the back corner, hoping to observe the classroom dynamics without drawing attention. The students here carried themselves differently than her California classmates. There was a polish to them, an assumption of belonging that came from generations of family money and social connections. She could feel curious glances in her direction, but she kept her eyes focused on her notebook, sketching absent patterns while listening to conversations about weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard and college prep programs in Europe. During the break between classes, Maya navigated the crowded hallways with practiced invisibility. She'd learned to read the geography of high school social hierarchies quickly, and Lincoln High's power structure revealed itself within minutes. The center of attention was clearly Dylan Brooks, who commanded space like he owned it. He stood nearly 6 feet tall with the kind of casual confidence that came from never being told no. His blonde hair perfectly styled and his expensive sneakers spotless despite the muddy October weather. His Lincoln High basketball warm-up jacket hung open over a designer t-shirt, and everything about his posture screamed entitlement. Flanking Dylan were his lieutenants, Ryan Walsh and Kevin Torres. Ryan had the stocky build of someone who'd been lifting weights since middle school. His red hair buzzed short and his freckled face permanently set in a smirk. Kevin was leaner, with calculating dark eyes and the kind of smile that made Maya instinctively wary. She'd encountered his type before, the one who whispered poison in the popular kid's ear and enjoyed watching the chaos unfold. But it was the girl laughing at something Dylan had said that made Maya pause in her careful observation. Jessica Hamilton was stunning in the way that seemed effortless, but probably required hours of preparation. Her golden hair caught the fluorescent lights perfectly, and her outfit looked like it had been pulled from a fashion magazine, casual but obviously expensive. When she laughed, The sound carried across the hallway, but Maya noticed something in her green eyes that didn't match the brightness of her smile. Standing slightly apart from the group, looking uncomfortable with the attention, was a boy who seemed different from the others. Ethan Martinez had warm brown eyes and dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, wearing a vintage band t-shirt and well-worn jeans that suggested he wasn't part of the country club's set. He kept checking his phone, and Maya caught him glancing toward the art wing when he thought no one was looking. Maya found her locker number 183 wedged between a cheerleader's mirror-covered shrine and someone's collection of energy drink cans. As she fumbled with the combination, she became aware of voices carrying from across the hall. Dylan's crew was discussing weekend plans, their conversations peppered with references to parties and places Maya had never heard of. She tried to focus on organizing her books, but couldn't help noticing how other students gave Dylan's group a wide berth, their deference born from something that looked more like fear than respect. The morning classes passed in a blur of introductory syllabi and awkward moments when teachers asked Maya to introduce herself to the class. She kept her answers brief and generic, sharing nothing about her family's reason for moving or her life in California. During lunch, she found an empty table near the windows and pulled out a worn paperback, grateful for the familiar weight of words that could transport her away from the cafeteria's social battlefield. From her corner table, Maya watched the intricate dance of teenage hierarchy play out around her. Dylan's table commanded the center of the room, their voices carrying over the general din as they planned weekend activities and discussed the upcoming homecoming dance. She noticed how Jessica occasionally looked uncomfortable when Dylan's jokes turned cruel, and how Ethan often seemed to be somewhere else mentally even when he was physically present at their table. The afternoon brought her favorite subject, art class, where she finally felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. The teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was a young woman with paint-stained fingers and genuine enthusiasm for her subject. When she asked students to create something that represented their identity, Maya found herself sketching without conscious thought, her pencil moving in fluid motions that spoke to muscle memory developed over years of training. The sketch that emerged showed a small bird perched on a branch, its wings folded but its eyes alert and watchful. Hidden in the delicate lines were subtle suggestions of power, the way the bird's talons gripped the branch, the coiled tension in its compact form. It was a self-portrait of sorts, though she doubted anyone else would recognize it as such. As the final bell rang and students flooded toward the exits, Maya gathered her things slowly, in no hurry to return to the empty house where her parents wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, and she decided to walk the long way home, hoping to find a quiet coffee shop or bookstore where she could decompress from her first day. What she found instead was the beginning of something that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Walking through the student parking lot after school, Maya couldn't help but notice the clear social stratification, even in the choice of vehicles. The front rows were dominated by luxury cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries, while older sedans and pickup trucks were relegated to the far corners near the chain-link fence. Dylan Brooks's pristine white BMW sat in the prime spot closest to the main entrance, its custom rims gleaming in the afternoon sun like a throne marking his territory. Maya had planned to take the long route home through the residential streets, but the sound of raised voices from the courtyard made her pause. A small crowd had gathered around the stone benches where students typically waited for their rides, their faces wearing the mixture of fascination and unease that accompanied any social drama. Through the gaps between onlookers, she could see Dylan standing over a thin sophomore boy with dark hair and thick glasses, his posture radiating the kind of casual menace that didn't require raised fists to be threatening. The target of Dylan's attention was Marcus Kim, a quiet kid Maya had seen in her advanced biology class that morning. He was clutching a violin case to his chest like armor, his knuckles white with the strain of gripping the handle. His voice was barely audible as he tried to explain something to Dylan, but the taller boy wasn't interested in explanations. Ryan Walsh stood behind Dylan's left shoulder, his arms crossed and his expression eager, like a dog waiting for permission to attack. Kevin Torres had positioned himself to Marcus's right, cutting off any potential escape route with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. Maya found herself moving closer despite every instinct telling her to walk away. She'd seen this scenario play out countless times in different schools, different states, but the dynamic never changed. There was always a Dylan, always a Marcus, always a crowd of bystanders who knew exactly what was happening but felt powerless to intervene. The unspoken rules were clear. Don't get involved. Don't make yourself a target. Don't upset the natural order that kept the school functioning under Dylan's particular brand of leadership. The conversation became clearer as Maya approached the edge of the crowd. Marcus had apparently bumped into Dylan earlier that day, causing him to spill coffee on his expensive jacket. The incident had been accidental, witnessed by several students, who could have vouched for Marcus's innocence, but Dylan wasn't interested in testimony or truth. He was interested in maintaining the fear that kept his position secure, and Marcus had provided the perfect opportunity for a public demonstration of power. Jessica Hamilton stood slightly apart from Dylan's inner circle, her designer purse clutched in both hands and her green eyes reflecting something that looked suspiciously like discomfort. She kept glancing between Dylan and Marcus, her perfect composure showing hairline cracks that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd witnessed her boyfriend's particular brand of justice. When Dylan's voice rose sharply, demanding that Marcus apologize not just for the coffee, but for existing in his space, Jessica actually flinched. Ethan Martinez occupied an even more complicated position in the social tableau. He was technically part of Dylan's group through his relationship with Jessica, but everything about his body language suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like he was preparing to leave. When Dylan made a particularly cruel comment about Marcus's appearance, Ethan looked away entirely, focusing on something in the distance that only he could see. The crowd of onlookers maintained their careful distance, close enough to witness the entertainment but far enough away to avoid becoming participants. Maya recognized the calculation in their faces, the same math she'd done herself countless times. Getting involved meant making yourself vulnerable, and high school survival often depended on maintaining invisibility. She saw seniors who could have intervened based on size alone, teachers who hurried past with their eyes fixed straight ahead, and underclassmen who watched with the horrified fascination of witnessing their own potential future. Dylan's performance was reaching its crescendo when he noticed Maya standing at the edge of the crowd, his blue eyes fixed on her with the predatory interest of someone who'd spotted potential new prey, and his cruel smile widened as he registered her unfamiliarity. Fresh meat was always more entertaining than the broken spirits he'd already conquered, and Maya's careful observation hadn't gone unnoticed. Well, Dylan said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced projection. Looks like we have an audience member who's actually paying attention. His words caused the crowd to turn toward Maya, their faces reflecting relief that someone else had drawn Dylan's focus away from them. Marcus Kim seized the moment of distraction to edge backward, but Ryan Walsh's heavy hand on his shoulder prevented any real escape. Maya felt her pulse quicken as dozens of eyes fixed on her, but she kept her expression neutral and her posture relaxed. Coach Alina's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that the first rule of conflict was never to show fear, even when facing superior numbers. Dylan was clearly testing her, trying to determine whether she would submit to his authority, or provide him with a more challenging target than poor Marcus. I don't think we've been properly introduced, Dylan continued, stepping away from Marcus and moving toward Maya with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. I'm Dylan Brooks, and this is my school. You must be the new girl everyone's been talking about. His tone was deceptively friendly, but Maya could hear the underlying threat that had probably terrorized dozens of students over the years. The crowd parted before Dylan like the Red Sea, creating a clear path between him and Maya that felt more like a gauntlet than a simple introduction. Jessica followed behind him, her heels clicking against the concrete with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Ryan and Kevin maintained their positions around Marcus, but their attention had shifted to this new development, their expressions eager with the possibility of expanded entertainment. Maya met Dylan's approach with steady eye contact, neither advancing nor retreating from her position at the crowd's edge. She'd learned from experience that bullies like Dylan fed on reactions, whether those reactions were fear, anger, or submission. The key was to give them nothing, to become as unremarkable as possible, while still maintaining enough dignity to avoid appearing weak. It was a delicate balance that required years of practice to perfect. When Dylan stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne and see the calculation in his eyes, Maya simply nodded. "Maya Chen," she said quietly, her voice carrying no challenge but no submission either. "Nice to meet you." The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how Dylan would respond to this careful neutrality. Dylan's smile faltered slightly at her refusal to be immediately intimidated, but he recovered quickly, his practiced charm sliding back into place like a mask. "Maya Chen," he repeated, as if testing how her name sounded in his mouth. "That's an interesting name. Where are you from, Maya Chen?" The question sounded casual, but Maya recognized it as an information-gathering mission designed to identify potential vulnerabilities. "California," she answered simply, offering no additional details that could be weaponized against her later. She watched Dylan process this information, probably filing it away with mental notes about her clothes, her accent, and her reluctance to elaborate. Behind him, she could see Marcus Kim finally managing to slip away from Ryan's loosened grip, clutching his violin case and disappearing toward the parking lot with the desperate speed of someone who'd narrowly escaped disaster. The interaction continued for several more minutes, Dylan probing for weaknesses while Maya deflected with polite brevity. She could feel the crowd's disappointment as it became clear that no immediate drama would unfold, but she also sensed Dylan's growing interest in this new puzzle that refused to solve itself according to his usual methods. When Jessica finally approached and suggested they should leave for their dinner reservations, Dylan's eyes never left Maya's face. "Welcome to Lincoln High, Maya Chen," he said finally, his tone carrying implications she chose not to analyze too deeply. "I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of each other." The promise felt more like a threat, but Maya simply nodded again and watched as Dylan's entourage finally dispersed, leaving behind the lingering tension of unfinished business. As the courtyard emptied and normal teenage conversations resumed, Maya realized she'd just experienced her first real test at Lincoln High. She'd passed for now, but Dylan Brooks wasn't the type to forget an interesting challenge. The real question was whether her careful neutrality would be enough to protect her from the attention she'd just attracted, or whether she'd simply delayed the inevitable confrontation that seemed to follow her from school to school. The October afternoon was growing cold, and Maya pulled her jacket tighter as she finally began her walk home through the tree-lined streets of Fairfield. Behind her, the imposing brick facade of Lincoln High cast long shadows across the emptying parking lot, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched from one of those gleaming windows high above. The morning of Maya's third day at Lincoln High began with the kind of gray October drizzle that made everything look washed out and dreary. She'd spent the previous evening researching the school's academic programs and extracurricular activities, trying to find spaces where she might blend in without attracting unwanted attention. The photography club met on Thursdays. The environmental science group was looking for new members, and there was even a small martial arts demonstration team that practiced after school. None of these activities would put her in Dylan Brooks's orbit, which seemed like the safest approach to surviving her senior year. Maya had developed a careful routine over her first 2 days, timing her movements through the hallways to avoid peak traffic and potential confrontations. She'd mapped out the quietest routes between her classes, identified bathrooms that weren't social gathering spots, and discovered a small alcove near the library where she could eat lunch without being observed. It was a strategy that had served her well in previous schools, allowing her to exist on the periphery until graduation finally freed her from the complicated politics of teenage social hierarchies. Her first period American history class was located on the second floor of the main building, requiring her to navigate the central staircase where students congregated between classes. Maya timed her ascent to coincide with the 5-minute warning bell, when most students were already in their classrooms and the hallways were relatively empty. She climbed the marble steps with her usual quiet efficiency, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her attention focused on the day ahead. She was halfway up the staircase when she heard her name being called from below. The voice was familiar in the worst possible way, carrying the kind of false friendliness that preceded trouble. Maya paused on the landing, her hand resting on the polished wooden banister, and turned to see Dylan Brooks ascending the stairs behind her with his characteristic swagger. He was flanked by Ryan Walsh and Kevin Torres, their presence transforming the innocent act of climbing stairs into something that felt more like a hunt. "Maya Chen," Dylan said again, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the stairwell. "Just the person I was hoping to see." His tone suggested this encounter wasn't accidental, and Maya realized with sinking certainty that her careful avoidance strategies had been noted and countered. Dylan had probably been watching her movements, learning her patterns, waiting for the perfect moment to corner her away from teachers and witnesses. The stairwell was empty except for the 4 of them, the acoustics designed to carry whispered conversations between floors, now amplifying Dylan's words with theatrical precision. Maya could hear the distant sounds of classroom doors closing and teachers beginning their lessons, marking the official start of the school day and her increasing isolation from potential help. She calculated the distance to the second floor, knowing she could reach it in a few quick steps, but also knowing that running would only delay the inevitable confrontation Dylan seemed determined to have. "Good morning, Dylan," Maya replied, evenly, keeping her voice neutral and her posture relaxed despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. She'd learned from Coach Elena that the first moments of any conflict determined its trajectory, and showing fear or aggression would only escalate whatever game Dylan was planning to play. Behind him, Ryan and Kevin spread out slightly, blocking her retreat down the stairs with the practiced coordination of a pack. Dylan continued his ascent until he stood one step below Maya, putting them at almost equal height and allowing him to maintain eye contact without looking up. It was a calculated positioning that demonstrated his understanding of psychological intimidation, and Maya found herself impressed despite her wariness. Most high school bullies relied on crude displays of force, but Dylan had refined his approach into something more sophisticated and ultimately more dangerous. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Dylan said, his blue eyes studying Maya's face for any sign of nervousness or submission. "You're an interesting addition to our school, Maya Chen. Very mysterious, very controlled." The way he emphasized the last word made it sound like an accusation, as if her composure was somehow offensive to his sensibilities. Maya remained silent, recognizing the interrogation technique of making statements that demanded responses without actually asking questions. Dylan was fishing for information, trying to provoke a reaction that would give him insight into her personality, and potential vulnerabilities. She'd seen this approach before from other Dylans in other schools, and the key was to offer nothing while maintaining enough engagement to avoid appearing defiant. "You know what I find interesting?" Dylan continued, apparently unbothered by her silence. "Most new students are eager to make friends, join groups, find their place in the social ecosystem. But you—" He paused, tilting his head as if studying a particularly puzzling specimen. "You seem content to remain on the outside, watching everyone else like you're conducting some kind of scientific experiment." Ryan Walsh shifted behind Dylan, his impatience evident in the way he cracked his knuckles and checked his phone. Kevin Torres remained motionless, but Maya could feel his dark eyes cataloging her reactions, storing information for future use. The stairwell felt smaller with each passing second, the marble walls closing in as Dylan's monologue continued. "I'm curious about what you're really doing here, Maya Chen," Dylan said eventually, his voice dropping to a more intimate register that somehow felt more threatening than his previous theatrical projection. "Because in my experience, people who work so hard to avoid attention usually have something to hide." He stepped up to the same level as Maya, eliminating the physical distance between them until she could smell his expensive cologne and see the gold flecks in his blue eyes. The accusation hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond typical teenage social maneuvering. Maya felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the trap Dylan was constructing around her. He was positioning her silence as evidence of guilt, her privacy as proof of deception, her desire to remain invisible as confirmation that she posed some kind of threat to his carefully maintained order. "I'm just trying to focus on my studies," Maya said finally, her voice steady despite the tension building in her shoulders. "Senior year is important for college applications." It was a safe response, the kind of bland academic motivation that most adults would approve of, but she could see immediately that Dylan wasn't satisfied with such a mundane explanation. Dylan's smile widened, revealing perfectly straight teeth that his parents had probably spent thousands of dollars perfecting. "Studies," he repeated, as if the word tasted strange in his mouth. "That's admirable, Maya Chen. Very responsible. But you know what I think?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. "I think you're afraid." The word hit Maya like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it was the exact button Dylan had been probing for since their first encounter. Fear was the currency of his power, the emotion he fed on and manipulated to maintain his position at the top of Lincoln High's social hierarchy. By naming it, by making it the centerpiece of their confrontation, he was demanding that she either confirm his assessment or prove him wrong through some kind of public demonstration. Maya met his gaze steadily, drawing on years of training that had taught her to remain calm under pressure. "I think we're both going to be late for first period," she said quietly, neither confirming nor denying his accusation. It was another deflection, another refusal to engage with his provocation, but she could see in his eyes that her continued composure was becoming its own form of challenge. Dylan stepped back slightly, his expression shifting from predatory interest to something that looked almost like respect. "You're tougher than you look, Maya Chen," he said, his voice returning to its normal volume as the sound of footsteps echoed from the floors above. "I like that. It's going to make this so much more interesting." Before Maya could ask what this referred to, Dylan moved aside with an exaggerated gesture of courtesy, clearing her path to the second floor. "After you," he said, his tone mockingly polite. "Wouldn't want you to be late for those very important studies." Ryan and Kevin parted as well, creating a corridor between them that felt more like running a gauntlet than simply climbing stairs. Maya walked past them with measured steps, neither hurrying nor dawdling, acutely aware of their eyes following her progress. She could feel Dylan's presence behind her like a shadow, and when she reached the second-floor landing, she heard his voice one final time. "See you around, Maya Chen," he called after her, the promise carrying implications that made her skin crawl. Real soon. As Maya disappeared into the hallway toward her American history classroom, she realized that her strategy of invisibility had not only failed, but had actively backfired. Dylan Brooks had identified her as a puzzle worth solving, a challenge worth pursuing, and she had just experienced what felt suspiciously like a declaration of war disguised as a friendly conversation. The gray October morning suddenly felt much colder, and Maya pulled her jacket tighter as she slipped into her seat just as the final bell rang. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she pushed through the double doors of Lincoln High's athletic complex during her lunch break. The encounter with Dylan on the staircase had left her nerves frayed and her carefully constructed composure cracking at the edges. She needed space to breathe, somewhere quiet where she could process what had just happened and figure out how to navigate the increasingly dangerous waters of her new school's social dynamics. The athletic wing was largely deserted during the lunch hour, with most students either in the cafeteria or gathered in their usual social clusters around campus. Maya wandered past empty locker rooms and darkened equipment storage areas, drawn by the familiar scent of rubber mats and the faint echo of physical exertion that seemed to permeate the walls. It was a smell that reminded her of home, of the countless hours she'd spent in training facilities that became sanctuaries when the rest of the world felt hostile and unpredictable. At the end of a dimly lit corridor, she discovered a door marked Auxiliary Gymnasium that stood slightly ajar. Maya hesitated for a moment, listening for voices or sounds of activity before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The space was smaller than the main gymnasium, with mirrored walls and specialized flooring that suggested it was used for dance classes or individual training rather than team sports. Afternoon sunlight filtered through high windows, casting geometric patterns across the polished wooden floor. What caught Maya's attention immediately were the heavy bags suspended from ceiling mounts in one corner of the room, along with speed bags, focus mitts, and other equipment that spoke to serious martial arts training. A small sign near the equipment identified this as the space used by Lincoln High's Wellness and Self-Defense Club, which met twice weekly after school. Maya approached the nearest heavy bag slowly, her fingers trailing along its worn leather surface with the reverence of someone greeting an old friend. The familiar weight and texture of the bag triggered a flood of memories that transported her instantly back to San Diego, to the converted warehouse space where Coach Elena Vasquez had transformed dozens of young fighters into disciplined athletes and confident human beings. Maya could almost hear Elena's voice cutting through the afternoon silence, calling out combinations and corrections with the authority of someone who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of teaching others to defend themselves. Elena Vasquez had been a professional fighter in her younger years, competing in kickboxing matches across California and Mexico before a career-ending knee injury forced her into coaching. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she commanded absolute respect from fighters twice her size through a combination of technical expertise and unwavering moral conviction. Elena believed that martial arts were not about creating weapons, but about forging character, and she refused to train anyone who couldn't demonstrate the maturity to handle the responsibility that came with such skills. Maya had been 12 years old when she first walked into Vasquez Combat Academy, a shy and awkward girl whose family had just moved to San Diego following her father's job transfer. She'd been drawn to the academy not by any particular interest in fighting, but by the confident way the female students carried themselves, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from their posture and movements. Her parents had been initially skeptical about enrolling their daughter in combat sports, but Elena's reputation for discipline and character development had eventually won them over. The first year of training had been brutal. Elena demanded perfection not just in technique, but in attitude, requiring her students to demonstrate respect, humility, and self-control before she would teach them anything remotely dangerous. Maya spent months learning basic stances, practicing breathing exercises, and conditioning her body through endless repetitions of fundamental movements. She was not allowed to spar or even touch the heavy bags until Elena was satisfied that she understood the philosophical foundations underlying the physical techniques. "Violence is not the goal," Elena would say during their morning meditation sessions, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Violence is the failure of all other options. A true fighter seeks to resolve conflict without throwing a single strike, and when that fails, they use the minimum force necessary to restore peace." Maya had absorbed these lessons along with the technical instruction, learning to view her growing skills not as tools for aggression, but as instruments of protection and last resort. By her sophomore year of high school, Maya had developed into one of Elena's most promising students. Her kicks were precise and devastating, capable of generating power that seemed impossible from her petite frame. Her hand techniques were swift and accurate, flowing seamlessly from defensive positions into counterattacks that could end confrontations before opponents realized they had begun. More importantly, she had internalized Elena's teachings about when and how to use these abilities, understanding that true strength came from restraint rather than demonstration. Standing alone in Lincoln High's auxiliary gymnasium, Maya found herself unconsciously falling into the fighting stance Elena had spent years perfecting. Her feet positioned at shoulder width, knees slightly bent, hands raised in a loose guard that could transition instantly into offense or defense. The muscle memory was so deeply ingrained that her body moved without conscious thought, flowing through the combinations that had become second nature after years of daily practice. She began with simple techniques, throwing jabs and crosses at the heavy bag with controlled power that made satisfying thudding sounds in the empty gymnasium. Her footwork remained light and precise, each step calculated to maintain balance and positioning. As her confidence grew, she began incorporating kicks, starting with basic front kicks and roundhouses, before progressing to the more complex techniques that had been her specialties in competition. Maya's left leg snapped out in a perfect shin kick that would have dropped most opponents, followed immediately by a spinning back kick that struck the bag with enough force to send it swaying on its chains. Her movements were fluid and economical, wasting no energy on unnecessary flourishes or dramatic gestures. This was fighting as Elena had taught it, technical and efficient, beautiful in its simplicity and terrifying in its effectiveness. For the first time since arriving at Lincoln High, Maya felt completely herself. The careful mask of invisibility she'd constructed melted away, replaced by the confident fighter Elena had spent years developing. Her breathing deepened and steadied, her muscles loosened as they remembered the rhythms of serious training, and her mind cleared of the anxiety and uncertainty that had plagued her since encountering Dylan Brooks. She worked through increasingly complex combinations, her fists and feet moving in patterns that told the story of countless hours spent in Elena's academy. There were techniques designed to stop charging opponents, others intended to create distance and escape routes, and still others that could incapacitate attackers who threatened innocence. Elena had taught her that every technique had its place and purpose, that violence was not random but surgical, applied with precision to achieve specific outcomes. As Maya's impromptu training session intensified, she found herself thinking about Dylan Brooks and his calculated campaign of intimidation. She could see now how his approach was designed to identify and exploit weakness, how he probed for psychological vulnerabilities that could be leveraged into submission. It was a sophisticated form of predation that relied on his target's inability or unwillingness to resist, and Maya realized that her attempts at invisibility had only made her more interesting to him. The heavy bag absorbed her frustration and anger, each strike carrying the weight of every humiliation she'd endured in every school she'd attended. Maya had spent years perfecting the art of not fighting, of deflecting and avoiding and enduring. But standing in that gymnasium with the familiar burn of exertion in her muscles, she remembered what it felt like to be powerful rather than powerless. Elena's voice echoed in her memory as Maya concluded her training session with a final devastating combination that left the heavy bag swaying violently. "The strongest fighter is the one who never has to prove it," her coach had always said. But when innocent people are threatened, when bullies prey on the vulnerable, then we have no choice but to stand up and fight. Not for ourselves, but for those who cannot fight for themselves. Maya stood in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the gymnasium windows, her breathing gradually returning to normal, her heart rate settling as the adrenaline faded from her system. She understood now that Dylan Brooks had made a critical miscalculation in choosing her as his next target. He had assumed that her quiet demeanor indicated weakness, that her attempts at invisibility reflected fear rather than choice. As she gathered her things and prepared to return to the regular rhythms of school life, Maya Chen was no longer the same person who had walked into that gymnasium 30 minutes earlier. The scared new girl who had been trying desperately to avoid conflict was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes conflict was unavoidable, and when that moment came, she would be ready. The question now was not whether Dylan Brooks would continue his campaign of intimidation, but whether he would recognize his mistake before it was too late to avoid the consequences. The week following Maya's discovery of the auxiliary gymnasium marked the beginning of what could only be described as Dylan Brooks's systematic campaign to break her carefully maintained composure. It started subtly, with seemingly accidental encounters that occurred with suspicious frequency throughout her daily routine. Maya would find Dylan and his crew lingering near her locker when she arrived each morning, their conversations always loud enough for her to hear, but never quite crossing the line into direct confrontation. During her second period chemistry class, Maya noticed Ryan Walsh had somehow managed to get himself transferred into her section, despite the fact that he'd been enrolled in a different time slot since the beginning of the semester. He positioned himself 2 seats behind her, close enough to make whispered comments about her appearance, her clothes, or her apparent lack of friends. The remarks were always delivered just under the volume threshold that would attract the teacher's attention, but loud enough to ensure Maya heard every calculated insult. The cafeteria became another battlefield in Dylan's war of attrition. Maya had established a routine of eating lunch in the far corner of the dining hall, away from the main social clusters where Dylan held court. But increasingly, she found herself the target of pointed glances and barely concealed laughter from his table. Jessica Hamilton seemed uncomfortable with the attention directed at Maya, but she never spoke up to deflect or discourage the behavior. Ethan Martinez appeared to be fighting his own internal battle, his jaw clenched whenever Dylan's comments became particularly cruel. Kevin Torres proved to be the most insidious of Dylan's lieutenants, possessing a gift for psychological warfare that made Maya's skin crawl. He had a talent for appearing in her peripheral vision at unexpected moments, always with that calculating smile that suggested he was cataloging her reactions for future reference. During passing periods, he would position himself strategically in hallways, forcing Maya to either change her route or walk uncomfortably close to him while he whispered comments that sounded like compliments but felt like threats. The harassment escalated beyond mere verbal intimidation during Maya's 3rd week at Lincoln High. She arrived at her locker one morning to find her combination had been changed, trapping her books and supplies behind a mechanism that no longer responded to the numbers she'd memorized. The main office claimed it was a computer glitch, but Maya noticed Dylan watching from across the hall as she struggled with the lock, his expression carrying satisfaction that confirmed her suspicions about the source of the problem. Her carefully organized schedule began falling apart as she found herself consistently late to classes, searching for alternative routes through the building that would avoid Dylan's increasingly frequent ambushes. Teachers began noticing her tardiness and academic performance, But Maya couldn't explain the situation without sounding paranoid or helpless. The isolation was exactly what Dylan had intended, cutting her off from potential allies and support systems that might have challenged his authority. The physical elements of the campaign began during her 4th week. Maya discovered her bicycle. Tires had been deflated, forcing her to walk home while Dylan's BMW cruised slowly alongside her, its occupants making comments about her apparent transportation difficulties. Her gym locker was broken into, her clothes scattered across the floor in a display that was meant to humiliate rather than simply vandalize. Each incident was carefully designed to avoid serious consequences while maximizing psychological impact. Maya found herself spending increasing amounts of time in the auxiliary gymnasium, working through her frustration and anger on the heavy bags with an intensity that would have concerned Coach Elena. Her sessions became longer and more violent, her techniques sharper and more devastating as she channeled her growing rage into physical expression. The mirror-lined walls reflected a young woman who looked increasingly dangerous, her movements carrying the precision of someone preparing for war rather than simply maintaining fitness. The internal conflict was becoming unbearable. Every fiber of her being wanted to end Dylan's campaign with a single devastating demonstration of her capabilities. She could visualize exactly how it would happen, could see the shock and fear in his eyes when he realized that his carefully chosen victim was actually a predator in disguise. Maya knew she could put Dylan in the hospital with techniques Elena had taught her, could embarrass him so thoroughly that his social status would never recover. But Elena's voice continued to echo in her memory, reminding her that violence was the failure of all other options, that true strength came from restraint rather than demonstration. Maya wrestled with the knowledge that she was allowing Dylan to continue his campaign not because she was weak, but because she was choosing to be stronger than her anger. The distinction was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the harassment intensified. Her parents began noticing changes in Maya's behavior, her increased anxiety and shortened temper at home. They asked careful questions about her adjustment to the new school, but Maya deflected their concerns with vague reassurances about typical teenage social dynamics. She couldn't explain that she was engaged in a psychological war with the school's most popular student, couldn't admit that she was struggling with the decision of whether to reveal her true capabilities. The breaking point seemed to approach. With each passing day, Maya caught herself fantasizing about the moment when Dylan would push too far, when her moral constraints would finally snap and she would be justified in showing him exactly what kind of person he had chosen to target. The anticipation was almost as exhausting as the harassment itself, a constant state of readiness that left her muscles tense and her nerves frayed. During one particularly intense training session, Maya found herself screaming at the heavy bag as she delivered a combination that would have shattered bones if applied to a human target. The sound echoed through the empty gymnasium, carrying years of suppressed rage and frustration that had nothing to do with Dylan Brooks and everything to do with a lifetime of choosing peace over violence. She stood trembling in the aftermath, her hands bleeding from the intensity of her strikes, understanding that she was approaching the threshold that would change everything. The worst part was knowing that Dylan had no idea what he was playing with. He saw a quiet new girl who seemed afraid to fight back, not recognizing that her restraint was actually the most dangerous thing about her. Maya understood that when the inevitable confrontation finally came, when Dylan's campaign finally crossed the line from harassment into actual violence, the outcome would be swift and devastating. The only question was whether she would be able to stop herself before she went too far. As October gave way to November, Maya felt the weight of inevitability settling over her like a heavy blanket. Dylan's campaign was escalating towards something that would demand a response, and when that moment came, all of Elena's teachings about restraint and responsibility would be put to the ultimate test. Maya could only hope that when the time came to act, she would remember the difference between justice and revenge. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.